Good afternoon and good evening, depending on where you're tuning in from today. Welcome to our first installment of Black, Brown and Green Voices for fall of 2023. I'm Dr. Miriam Nihan-Gray, and I will be your host today with this wonderful program. We're very excited to welcome our speaker today, and I will hand over to my colleague Kim DaCosta to formally introduce Professor Bernstein in a moment. It's an immense honor to kick off these programs, marking in some way, or reflecting, or I don't really know what word is the right one to use sometimes in these conversations, but it is the 160th anniversary of the New York Draft Riots. And I want to remind our audience that we'll have two programs around this theme, and Professor Bernstein today kicking off the programs, and the esteemed scholar of African American history, Professor Leslie Harris, who will be with us in December on a similar topic. So do join us then for that one. I'm sure Professor Bernstein's talk today and interview will whet your appetite. I'll just run through a few housekeeping matters before I hand over to my NYU and African American Irish Diaspora Network colleague, Kim, to introduce Professor Bernstein. We are recording today's event, and it will be published later on the Glucksman Ireland House NYU YouTube channel. We will share the link with you if you want to watch it back or if you want to share it with others. We plan to run for about 60 to 65 minutes today maximum. The first 40 minutes or so will involve Professor Bernstein and I talking, doing an interview about the theme of his book. And please feel free to place comments or questions in the chat, and I will pick them up towards the end of the program. We'll try to get to as many as we can. I'd like to thank the teams at Glucksman Ireland House and African American Irish Diaspora Network for their support in mounting this program. And I'd also like to thank our promotional partners, NYU's John Brademas Center, especially Tom McIntyre and Polly Terzian, NYU's Office for Global Inclusion, especially Autumn Rain and Tara Nakata, and NYPL Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, especially Sonia Richards, Joy Bivens, the director, and Lisa Herndon. Now, let me hand you over to my wonderful colleague and friend, Professor Kim DaCosta, with whom I've collaborated on some of these activities over the last few years, to introduce our speaker. Handing over to you, Kim.
Thank you so much, Miriam. It's my pleasure today to welcome Professor Iver Bernstein, who is Professor of History, African and African American Studies, and American Culture Studies at Washington University in St. Louis. He writes about the origins and significance of the Civil War, the roots of racialized violence, and the possibilities of democratic, political, and social movements. He's especially interested in the traumatic histories, sometimes forgotten, sometimes unspoken, of slavery, race, and war that shaped the United States national drama of revolution and rebellion, creative destruction, and reinvention. His book, The New York City Draft Riots, Their Significance for American Society and Politics in the Age of Civil War, published by Oxford in 1990, engaged such traumatic histories and national dramas. His current book project, Stripes and Scars, How Americans Came to Fight a Bloody Civil War, also to be published by Oxford, focuses on the origins and significance of the US Civil War. Drawing upon extensive archival research, he seeks to explain the origins of the annihilating violence of the Civil War, with special attention to the context of the everyday violence of enslavement. He's also got two other book projects, James Baldwin and American Democracy, and The Material World of Modern Segregation, which engage racialized experience in the US, particularly the relationships between its intimate and public domains and between its material and political dimensions. So with that body of work, you can see why we are so excited to invite Professor Bernstein here today. Professor?
Thank you so much, Kim. I'm actually going to just pick up a little bit and then pose the first question with Iver. It's exactly 160 years ago in September 1863. I note that there were still memorial services taking place to mark the losses during the 4 days from Monday, the 13th of July, 1863 to the Friday, July 17th. These riots, the worst urban riots in American history, sometimes feel a little bit overlooked. And to set the tone of the events and the complexity of what was at play in July 1863, I'm going to kick off by reading a short piece penned by Professor Bernstein, on a book on slavery in New York City in 2005. And this is entitled Black and Green. I think it sets the tone nicely before we go into the formal questions. By 1861, at the time of the Civil War, tension between Black and Irish New Yorkers was a familiar story. Indeed, even before the massive influx of Irish immigrants precipitated by the Great Famine of the mid-40s, Irish working men often took the lead in driving African Americans from the artisanal trades that they had performed as slaves, and had also begun to crowd Black workers from the ranks of menials. The advent of the war raised expectations on both sides, each group hoping that the military struggle would help them secure their tenuous claims to full incorporation into American society. But as the Lincoln administration expanded its war aims to include emancipation, and Black New Yorkers moved to solidify their precarious presence in the city, there was a quickening tempo of Irish intimidation and assault against Black men, women, and children. With the encouragement of pro-slavery Democrats, the most desperate Irish Catholic poor came to see their interests pitted against the discriminatory draft, the war, and their more desperate Black neighbours who lacked what they believed was the only reliable marker of true American identity, a white skin. Nevertheless, there was no small irony in the Irish American rioters' hysterical attempts to purify their neighbourhoods and workplaces of Black men through bonfires, lynch murders, and drownings. The lives of the city's poorest African Americans and Irish American families were intimately bound together. They lived in close proximity and in many cases depended on each other for material and emotional sustenance. Both groups faced brutalizing racial slurs. The Irish mob's Riot Week campaigns to erase a Black presence can only be understood at the deepest levels of consciousness as a kind of annihilation of self, intelligible only against the backdrop of panic in the face of the draft, emancipation, and the recent Confederate defeat at Gettysburg. There's a lot in there, Ivor, and it kind of sets the tone for such a big story. But I don't want to assume that people tuning in today, people who are familiar with New York history or not, know exactly what happened during these draft riots. Can you just briefly explain what happened in New York between July 17th, 13th and 17th, 1863?
Thank you for that. Thank you, Kim DaCosta, for that generous introduction, and thank you, Miriam, for that question. It's such an honor to be here. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. So I do want to give a kind of brief, I don't know, synopsis of what happened in New York City between July 13th and July 17th. But before I step into that narrative, I want to frame it with the observation that, as you got a sense of from Miriam's reading of that that little excerpt, Black and Green, from the Slavery in New York piece I wrote, this is challenging material. Even if you're familiar with it to some extent, and as Miriam said, many people are not, it still shakes you to your core. It provokes you to think deeply about the traumatic dimensions of American history that lie submerged part of the warp and woof of the African American experience as well as the Irish American experience, and the hidden and unacknowledged layers of the white American experience, and you could say the history of American democracy, but never really acknowledged as such. So with that little preface, I mean, the short answer to the question is that New York indeed experienced its own version of the Civil War in these 4 or 5 day, depending on how you count, this riot, insurrection. It was the largest, you could say, the largest civil, or certainly the largest urban civil insurrection in U.S. history, with the exception of the Civil War itself. The insurrection of the South against the U.S. government, right? And it was violent from the outset. It began on Monday, the 13th of July, 1863, a little over a week after Union Army victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg. And it was a kind of unbearably tense week in New York City, a week in which New Yorkers pored over the lists of hundreds of dead and wounded from their city that were published as front page news in the newspapers. This meat grinder war, New Yorkers saw all too clearly in those lists of names, is the war to which we poor men, in the case of the draft riders, we poor white men are going to be consigned to an almost certain mass death, leaving our already destitute families in ruin or to ruin. The draft was was based on a March 3rd, 1863 Federal Conscription Act, and the U.S. Congress had passed that act at a moment when the Union Army seemed to be desperately in need of new soldiers, new human material. And it contained a clause that allowed drafted men who paid $300 to buy their way out of the draft. That clause, from the standpoint of the Lincoln Republican government, was an egalitarian measure, at least so they understood it, that put a monetary ceiling on the inevitable market in substitutes. Or so they hoped, but $300 represented a year's wages to a poor New Yorker. In a slogan that carried a world of meaning, the white mobs would shout in the first hours of violence, quote, "Black slaves are sold for $1,000 down south, and we are sold for $300. It gives you an idea of how important that $300 figure was, and the way in which the white poor, alongside their Black neighbors, but in kind of a rivalry with them in terms of this quote, right? They are sold down south for $1,000. We are sold here for 300. It revealed how this white and so often Irish immigrant poor saw itself as teetering on the edge of enslavement. Men with a price, less than American, less than white, indeed in a fear and shame they could hardly acknowledge, and they had to do something with that fear in this panicky moment. Their status, the draft seemed to confirm that their status as men could be bought, sold, replaced. So now, the morning of the 13th, that Monday, after a lottery on the hot Saturday beforehand and a Sunday of sitting in the saloons talking about what was going on, this insurrection, mob action began as the authorities were resuming the draft lotteries that morning. And the mobs invaded the draft office on the Upper East Side. Then it was sort of a shanty district. They smashed the draft lottery wheel. They set the building on fire. And already, and this is the way I read the draft riots, you could see conflicts everywhere, civil wars within civil wars, right? Some of the rioters wanted to shut down the draft, shut it down violently and for good, call it a day. but others battled the fire companies, many of those fire companies that appeared on the scene, by the way, were also staffed by Irish Americans. But some of the Irish mobs battled the Irish fire companies that arrived on the scene to douse the flames, in other words, trying to encourage the flames to spread to adjacent buildings and residences. So the point is that it very quickly became clear that these mobs, composed predominantly of the poorest Irish Americans of the famine generation and its sons and daughters, had an unfolding range of targets. And of course, you can overplay this, but in terms of the selectivity and the strategic dimension of these mobs, they were, after all, people enraged, people living on a kind of existential edge. But they singled out the institutions of Lincoln's Republican Party in New York, such as what they perceived, one of those to be Horace Greeley's New York Daily Tribune office, Greeley, the anti-slavery editor, the townhouses of Republican officials, postmasters, Abram Wakeman, abolitionists, James and Abby Hopper Gibbons, the policemen and Union Army soldiers who attempted to defend the government and property, but they actually could wreak their anger, their rage on fellow Irish people like Colonel Henry F. O'Brien, who was an Irish Union Army officer to whom the Catholic rioters denied a priest's final unction after they defaced and pummeled his body, now lifeless body, over many hours. But wartime industries, factories that manufactured weapons for the Union Army, and the mob wanted those weapons, the bridges that would allow federal troops to access and retake the city, and this is something I'm going to foreground and emphasize most grotesquely, the African Americans whom the mobs perceived as clients and symbols of the Republican Party government, as well as competitors both for jobs and women, white jobs and what the mob perceived as white women, their women, if you will. The rioters attacked interracial households and brothels where race mixing took place. African American men in particular became targets, and the white mobs hunted them through the streets of the city, staging lynchings where they hanged these men, setting bodies on fire, drowning or discarding black bodies in the river, in acts of contempt, desecration, and unavoidably, we have to say, imagined purification. In other words, in this moment, fearing their own annihilation from the war and the draft, the mobs practiced annihilation against their black neighbors. Indeed, they often went after the defenseless, the weak, the vulnerable, the children of the colored orphan asylum, the disabled black coachman, Abraham Franklin. Indeed, so panicky was this moment that some mobs hoisted the Stars and Stripes, others cheered for Jefferson Davis. Looting took place, targeted and indiscriminate, focused and scattershot, not always directed but against political sites, but sometimes, like with Brooks Brothers, which manufactured clothing for Union soldiers. Get the clothes, but yeah, Brooks Brothers, an evil Union contractor. The city's elite found itself devoid of the usual military protection that the ideal of private property in New York, a city with a history of mobs and rebellions dating back centuries, had always required for its enforcement. Only an invalid corps remained as the rest of the federal military had been rushed south to the battlefield at Gettysburg. And in my book, I detail the way the city's elites sharply divided over the question of whether the Lincoln administration should come in the most ham-fisted way, suspend habeas corpus, declare martial law in the city, put it under military rule. And there were, a kind of emerging merchant industrial leadership in the city that said yes to martial law. But sometimes the dominant and often Southern sympathizing Democratic political machine, backed by nabobs like the mega wealthy August Belmont, said, no martial law. We can restore order on our own. And this was an ironic stance, of course, because the Democratic political leaders of New York City and state had done so much to stir up the ire of their immigrant political base against the draft, and Lincoln had done so much to foment the violence in the first place. Just another word, because I've taken some time and space to set the stage here. But order was restored when Lincoln and Secretary of War Stanton ordered 5 battle-weary Union regiments north from Gettysburg, and they quashed the violence on July 16th in some titanic battles, scattering mobs with howitzers, overrunning the barricades that the strategically minded white mobs had established around their uptown neighborhoods. And bands of white marauders would continue in coming days and weeks to loot the abandoned homes of their Black neighbors. I know that's something Miriam wants to talk about in terms of Black people who fled the city. But by the morning of the 17th, the draft riots as an episode of insurrectionary violence were over. Martial law was never declared in New York, unlike Maryland in 1861, for example, where Lincoln suspended habeas corpus. And when the draft was resumed in New York City later that summer, Boss Tweed's Democratic Tammany Hall, in fact, passed an expansive city bond measure, paying the commutation fees of poor drafted men, allowing for the purchase of substitutes, and making sure that the Union Army got its men without blowing up New York City again.
Wow. There's a lot going on there, and in rereading your book, Ivor, in preparation for this, and reading your chapter from that wonderful publication on slavery in New York City, one thing that you're very deliberate about, well, one thing I want to say, because I know I've heard you or read you saying it before, is the challenge for us to put ourselves in the historical moments of the time, not seeing it through the lens of what's happened since, etc., etc. And I've seen you elsewhere talk about the kind of lines of identity of us and them, the fluidity that existed in this period. I think it's important to remind ourselves and to remind our audience today about the challenges in terms, or that the need for us to be very self-aware and self-conscious. What you do so well in the book here is kind of outline the progression. You go into pretty forensic detail in as much as the sources would allow you to kind of convey the moving, what would you say, the shifting dynamic of the rioting and the different stakeholders or players in terms of what they're trying to get out of this at any given moment in time. Would you like to speak to that a little bit, Ivor?
Well, I hear two things in your question. One is about the fluidity of this particular moment in American history, this particular time and place, New York City at the height of the Civil War. So fluidity, but the other piece is just sort of the unfolding dynamics. I think it was some reviewer who said that the book was a Rashomon-like treatment of the draft riots, Rashomon, which is a reference to the film that reconstructs a murder by telling the story through 4 or 5 completely, intertwined but independent perspectives, as trying to capture the subjectivity of those different perspectives, and I felt that was an apt characterization of what the book was after, and that I really took pains to try and understand the world as each of a cast of characters, a dramatis personae of New York City social and cultural political groups lived it, perceived it, knew it. And that did open up the door to the other thing which you mentioned, which is the fluidity, because I became increasingly aware of how intertwined these groups were. And so the question of survival, was urgent for the poor white mobs, but of course also for African Americans, but also for the elites of the city, who were all of which didn't know how the Civil War would turn out. Right, Gettysburg and Vicksburg had just been victoriously fought, but at an enormous cost. And indeed, at the moment of the draft riots, the Army of Virginia, the Robert E. Lee's command, was still moving somewhere north of the Potomac. In other words, its location was uncertain. And the notion for all of these groups at this existential moment that there might be some kind of 11th or 13th hour reversal, of historical fortunes was profound. So they were, in that sense, left to their own devices. It's like I'll say more about this perhaps in another context, but in the very sort of last hours of the uprising or insurrection or riot or mob action, the Irish rioters behind the barricades were driven to the roofs of tenements, and they had this kind of question um, about how to make their last stand, right? Whether they wanted to leap off roofs or surrender, or and women in the mobs, and the role of women is something that I'm keenly interested in terms of this event. Women were shouting, die at home, die at home," which sort of conveyed that existential sense that the end of the world is now. We don't know how this, but if we're going to fight in a war, this is our war, and this is our last stand, and this is our home. This question, of course, for the Irish diaspora, where's home? Well, gee, home is in this encounter with with the authorities of the U.S. government in this moment. So anyway, those are the thoughts that your question triggers. Yeah.
And Ivor, kind of following a little bit from that, when I was rereading in the run up to this, it's a very Irish city. I think that I think I found there was like 200,000 or so Irish in the city. Does that sound about right? And I was surprised by how, well, maybe I shouldn't have been surprised, only approximately 12,000 African Americans in the city. So there's a big difference in those demographics. Now, I know there would have been other groups present as well, but it is quite an the Irish, I mean, obviously it's the aftermath of the famine and things like that. The Irish presence is pretty marked.
Hugely so, and the Irish have done a very, I mean, when you talk about their sort of physical, material presence in the city, and then by extension their political presence, they control votes, they control newspapers, not they still. I'd like to talk more about the Irish. Maybe we can have a kind of dedicated moment to talk about the Irish sort of contradiction, if you will, of a kind of feeling of ownership and real political reach in the city, extending to the James Gordon Bennett's New York Herald and Catholic newspapers, and the visibility and articulate power of Archbishop John Hughes, the sort of ultramontanist, assertive Catholic leader of New York City, who was a world famous figure, and lionized, of course, by the Irish Catholics of the city. So they control space, but they also are have become really overnight, in terms of the long history of the city, they have become so important. African Americans are not just few in number, but they are. This is the era long before the Harlem Renaissance, right? They are not occupying a Mecca. They are occupying small fragmented enclaves. That is the penumbra of slavery. That is what slavery does. It fragments Black people's ability in slavery, of course, but also on the edges of slavery, to be able to concentrate, to be able to form. And it's really only getting back to demography, where you started, it's really only the large entrance into the city of African Americans from the South during the long Great Migration that makes a different way of being in the city and in the world possible for African Americans.
And what's also, I think, important to mention, Ivor, in the context of what happens in July 1863 is, as you outline, from 1861 or so, the increasing vulnerability of Black New Yorkers, right, in terms of their presence seen as more and more of a threat, or, you know, this kind of unsafe feeling that seemed to heighten quite significantly in the run-up to of these events, correct?
Absolutely. Well, of course, New York, like other northern cities on the border, famously Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York. These cities are to a very great extent southern outposts, right? They're southern satellites. Of course, it's a twice told tale that Southerners did their their cotton factoring, their banking in New York City. On a more visceral and brutally violent level, Wall Street, as we know from Jonathan Daniel Wells' new book, The Kidnapping Club, was in, and Philip Foner's old work, The Business and Slavery. You know, New York's wealthiest elements were in cahoots with slave owners, particularly when it came to the brutally mundane and violent business of recapturing the human beings that they claimed as property, and shipping them back to Maryland or Virginia. So all of that is, and this is, of course, the New York of the Dred Scott case. For all of that, African Americans do see, with the start of the war in particular, a kind of ray of hope. I mean, there's and it's more than a ray so far that even what with the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 still intact, they realize that the world is changing, and even if they don't want to necessarily fight and die for a North that doesn't necessarily care about them, right? They are, and a Northern government, the Lincoln government, which is still moving very slowly on civil rights, to put it in a general way. Things are changing for them. The moment in 1862 when Nathaniel Gordon, the slaver, captain of the Echo, an Atlantic slave trading ship, is executed in New York City, that is a big signal to Black New Yorkers that things are changing, right? In my Slavery New York essay, I talk about how James Pennington, who's wandering around New York City looking for his family and sees his property absolutely devastated by the mobs, is coming from a very successful convention in Poughkeepsie of Black leaders, part of the broad colored convention movement. Yeah. So there is, and I think that they are caught between desperation and hope in that moment, just to just try and keep both of those things alive. They're vulnerable, but they are hopeful.
Yeah, Kim DaCosta has a question there, but just if I can just ask this quick one, Ivor, like, so the other big ethnic group of the time in New York are the German Americans, right? And I didn't go back to double check to see if I don't think there are quite as many German Americans in New York as there would have been Irish American, but I think they would have been a sizable enough presence. Is the tension that evolves between African Americans and Irish Americans particular to the Irish, or is it more structural? This is kind of a big question, but is it more structural in terms of they're the ones at the cold face in terms of the competition, or if it's easier to say, how do German Americans, for example, fit into this? They do seem to have a presence in the rioting as well, right?
Yeah, it's such a multi level
Yeah,
question. I love
yeah.
I love your metaphor at the rock face, or at the, in other
Oh,
words,
yeah.
they're working together in either collaboration or rivalry. And you are right about that. In other words, particularly on the docks, um, one of the things that my book captures is the way in which the nascent labor movement in the city is very much just because of the numbers um, in the the poorest. I won't say least skilled. I mean, dock work actually could be quite skilled, and I think that whole notion of skill needs to be re-examined, particularly in terms of black wage work. So black wage workers and white wage workers on the docks are in both furious collaboration and furious competition for survival. And the Irish dock workers and stevedores create these all-white work rules on the eve of the draft riots, but I don't think they're terribly much enforced, except that there's a long dock strike where there's an attempt to enforce them in June of 1863. But I'm struck in many parts of the racial dynamic of the city with the amount of effective intermixing and interdependency between Irish people and Black people, even in the poorest. In other words, you could say, an Irish dock worker could say about this Black worker, oh, he's not Black, he's Bob Smith. In other words, I know that guy. And, I mean, what does it mean to be white or Black anyway in that? It's really only with a tremendous amount of uh, kind of uh, demagogic haranguing and mobilizing, both by labor leaders, but by the Democratic press and by Catholic leaders, that this very much uh, intertwined sort of, I don't know, to use a different word, miscegenated world of black and white is somehow, the draft riots are kind of like an effort to hack that in two, to razor it apart. But it's deeply connected. Getting back to the Germans, they do Germans, of course, are predominantly Protestant. Many of them are refugees of the 1848 repressed revolution in the German lands. And of course, they have their own German language newspapers. They're very prominent in parades because I don't think that many Germans speak English. So the way in which they communicate to their fellow workers and to the larger city often is by visual imagery, and not necessarily through through the press, which was so. But they're Protestant, and that's very important too. I'll say one more thing, Miriam, because your question is just like it's just like an ocean of
I know,
possibilities.
I'm sorry, I hate asking.
I'll just say one more word about it, which is I think that that the notion that many German Protestants were anti-slavery means, first of all, that and on the sort of street level, there are moments when German Americans actually attempt with guns to rescue Black people who are endangered by Irish mobs, to give you just to play all of that out. So if you read the court records, you see these very courageous German American small businessmen who step forward and basically try and, I mean, they're concerned about the welfare of this Black person, but they're also concerned with the need to protect the sort of world of the petty bourgeoisie in there, which means can't burn it down, right? Have to. So and there are German Catholics, and they tend to be more conservative, but that there is that kind of Protestant bond between the African American community and many German Americans.
I've lots more questions, as Ivor knows, but Kim, you want to come in with something there? I want to give you an opportunity.
I just wanted to jump in on this because I'm trying to kind of put myself in that context as you've been so richly describing it, Ivor. And I guess what I find so troubling, compelling, and I'm not sure about is how you go about explaining the level and the type of violence that you describe in detail in your work that is almost hard to read, let alone enact and experience. Because when I think about the demographic imbalance of Blacks to Irish in New York at this time, when I think of the relative strength of Catholic leaders or political Irish leaders, I think, well, why the fear of Black people who have so little? And can fear be the explanation to justify the kind of violence pitted not just against Black men, but women and children? And there's almost a sort of psychoanalytic dimension to the language I read in your work, and I wonder what you have to say about that, given all the stuff that you've done on race and intimacy and these ideas.
Well, you've really put your finger on my intellectual pulse, and actually my forthcoming book is deeply influenced by particularly psychoanalytic writing about siblings and Juliet Mitchell's famous siblings, sex, and violence, and now she has a new book called Fratriarchy, which I think is just a brilliant phrase. In other words, these are the sense that in the kind of closely intertwined male fraternities of working class New York City, but I would also argue the Civil War itself, and that's really the burden of persuasion of my book, that there is these kind of hysterical rivalries, really between the dispossessed and the still more dispossessed, if you will, between Irish Americans and African Americans, do have that psychoanalytic dimension. I mean, the idea from the Irish perspective that they are somehow prior, and whiteness is the way they try and in other words, their claims to property and governance and status are somehow prior, and they are being replaced. I mean, the language of replacement theory in 2023 is all over this material in ways that my new work makes clear. Of course, there is the very definition of a brother or a sibling is somebody who you could either love or kind of love to death, because they have the possibility of replacing you, because what is a sibling structurally other than someone who is bears enormous resemblance to you, and so again, that sounds a little formulaic, but it does actually breathe through this evidence. I'm a very archival scholar, and it really does breathe through this evidence. And then the irony, I'll just say one more thing, Kim, if I'm hopefully answering your question, but the irony, of course, is that one of the great and maybe first profound big lies in American history is that the moment when the Irish poor during the Civil War and the draft rioters say they are coming to replace us, meaning Black freed people from the South, they're gonna, if you end slavery, President Lincoln or Republicans, newly emancipated freed people are going to flood into New York City and take our jobs. But of course, the lie, or it's more than an irony, it's really a big lie, is that white Irish American workers elbowed African Americans out of their jobs their often new wage earning jobs. I mean, the general emancipation of the end of slavery in New York comes in 1827. So there is a sense in which free Black people are already established with their toehold on respectability and employment when the famine Irish come in. And so indeed it's the historical fact is Irish people stealing Black jobs, if you will, elbowing Black workers out of their jobs. That's the unlovely origins of the American labor movement in New York City. And then accusing Black people of in this sort of massive distortion of history of doing that to them or threatening to do that to them. It's not reminds me of there's a wonderful line in the autobiography of Black Hawk, the Sauk native leader, where he says, "I couldn't believe that the white settlers who are driving me and my people off my land actually blame us for they're calling um, uh, themselves the victims. They say that we are the expropriators, the marauders." How he in a kind of sick laughter, he says, let's get serious, or how can they believe that? But there's some kind of I think a white settler dynamic is perhaps the rather crude way to start talking about it, that is very much in play in a number of early mid-19th century U.S. history moments.
Yeah,
Does that help?
it's, yes, absolutely. Really rich material to bring forward. Thank you.
That was a great question, Kim, and thanks for that fascinating answer, Ivor. Can I ask you both? Kim and I are really interested in, it's something that I often think about is for those Black Irish families that would have lived through this. I mean, on such a, emotional, communal level. In your reading of the sources, Ivor, and I know if I remember correctly, one mixed race boy may have been lynched, if I remember correctly. Can you speak a little bit about what you've been able to construct for people for whom the allegiances in both groups must have made this so much more difficult to experience?
Well, social isolation, unfortunately, seems to have been the norm in this moment. I mean, you want to understand kind of the subtext of Kim's question, which is why are the dispossessed and the more, still more dispossessed not finding some kind of common ground? Well, the answer is that they are terribly isolated in this moment. And of course, they are being they're having their differences shouted at them by newspapers and all manner of white supremacist leadership in democratic New York City at this time. Um, but getting back to the households, so the household, if you think about it, like the integrated workplace, the integrated household is a um, it's a kind of island of integration in a world of isolation. And you just think of how vulnerable these families are. They tend to judging from a kind of impressionistic survey of court records that I conducted quite a few years ago. I mean, a lot of these households were on the edges of the city. I mean, so that the people, and this is a moment, a few years after the destruction of Seneca Village, which was a very sort of coherent um, African American enclave on the site of present-day Central Park. Of course, it was raised in order to create Central Park, but that might have been an environment where you would, and on the edges of the city, where you would find a certain greater freedom of association and movement by the parents and children of those those mixed families. Again, coming back to the point that I've made, I really do see there being quite a lot more mixing and interdependence, both at the workplace but also in the family context. And then, in a way, the draft riots are this absolutely horrifying, grotesque anomaly. They come like a knife, sort of insisting on difference. And then the last thing I'll say about those households is that the Irish mobs who are going door to door targeting these mixed race households, of course, in their campaign of purification, if you will, which is, in my view, both religious and sexual. I mean, in other words, it's dealing with primal matters and sexual access being a very key primal matter. Um, those mobs are they're invoking the pretty much ancient, or in 1863 terms, long ancient charivari, the notion that the community has some right to be able to interrogate newlyweds. Well, of course, these households were not newlyweds, but they were, in other words, it has the right to enforce its moral standards and break up households or marriages which are seen as morally suspect or violative in some, in the kind of primal scheme that I'm, sort of talking about here. So there's something both very modern and industrial, and also something very sort of rural and ancient about this kind of practice of focusing attention on those people in particular. Yeah.
Ivor, the outcome, or some of the outcomes of the draft riots, as we're reminded in your wonderful research, 3,000 African Americans, I believe, end up homeless. There's a decline of about 20% in the African American population of New York. There are 119 deaths. I believe the majority of them are actually Irish Americans, or about, if I estimate, about 12 African Americans from your work. But you write a little bit about, and the economic damage, I can't remember the equivalent of whatever million it was. But you write a little bit about a collective amnesia around these events. And I know that's another big question, but could I ask you just to speak briefly to that, and to perhaps, you've been working on this, or no, you haven't, well, actually your new book is related to it, but you've been thinking actively about this stuff since approximately 1980. And I'm just wondering, in the course of the trajectory of your intellectual engagement, and maybe the present that we find ourselves in, if you've anything you could reflect on in terms of how this history is received, or how you present it, or whatever you feel comfortable sharing.
Sure, I'll answer that question in a couple of pieces. First, collective amnesia. Let's focus on that part. Of course, collective memory with regard to an event like the New York Draft Riots tends to be eruptive, episodic, right? Not continuous or sustained. If you the sociologist Maurice Halbwachs wrote a book called On Collective Memory, and the beauty of that book is that he really it's sort of capital C collective, capital M memory. In other words, you need to mobilize a lot of interests and a lot of power in order to build monuments. That's why it took the United Daughters of the Confederacy, and in the case of the St. Louis Confederate Monument, the city of the government of the city of St. Louis, and a lot of coordination of power in various configurations to build a Confederate monument in the largest public park in St. Louis. You have not had those coordinated interests mobilizing in behalf of the collective memory of the New York Draft Riots. To my knowledge, I was reading up on this before before today's conversation. There is no historic trail of let's visit New York Draft Riot sites. There is in East St. Louis there is a series of sort of markers which allow you to try and conjure up the world of the East St. Louis pogrom of 1917, which in so many ways was the dishonorable successor to the New York draft riots at the height of the Great Migration, and also at the height of another World War, World War One. So it can be done, but in New York, not so much. So that's interesting to me. If you had asked me in 1990 whether by 2023 there would be some more public and formalized public reckoning through memorialization of this event, and particularly of the Black martyrs, I would have said, yeah, it should, it's a generation. Maybe in a generation you could imagine it, but no. And that tells you something, right? In terms of what I've learned, of course, when I did the initial research, I did not have access to digitized databases. I could not do, do targeted word searches across interconnected databases. A colleague of mine at Washington University has created something called SLIDE, the St. Louis Integrated Database of Enslavement, or the acronym SLIDE, where a whole series of records of enslaved people's lives are actually, and the white people who interacted with those enslaved people, are all word searchable. It's a work in progress, but to have that only coming into existence now, again, dare I say, 30 years after that initial research, is an interesting point. And the Slavery in New York volume was a landmark moment. Northern lynching, in terms of, we think of lynching as a Southern phenomenon. So what does Northern lynching look like? Of course, there were lynch mobs. I think there were lynch mobs in Port Jervis, New York, and in all kinds of places you wouldn't necessarily expect. So there is a history of Northern lynching, but it's simply, we've become much more aware of the nationalization of enslavement and the nationalization of exactly the kind of annihilationist racial complex that Kim was talking about. And then that interestingly complicates the whole question of what the Civil War was. If you have annihilationist, white supremacist forces on both sides of the Mason-Dixon line, well, then maybe we need to think a little differently about what the Civil War involved, or what it was about, with enslavement metastasizing through the national polity in that way. Does that help?
You're muted, Miriam.
Yeah, no, it also brings me back again, I think for some modern, people in the present who are engaging and thinking, and when I talk to people about the New York Draft Riots, it seems so at odds with their perception of modern day New York as this liberal and democratic, progressive kind of space, right? That, as you mentioned, the kind of pro-slavery leanings or connections, and how, that challenge again of us thinking historically, not projecting back from the present, etc. No, Ivor, I feel like we could talk to you for another hour, and alas, I wish we had another hour, but we look forward to your forthcoming book, which it sounds like will be another groundbreaking piece of research related to what we've spoken about today. It's a difficult topic, and I hope that, I know I've certainly learned a lot, and I think Kim has, and I hope the people who have joined us today, and for people who will view back this fabulous interview, will, kind of revisit the material or think about it or pick up. It's probably still in print. I know it was reissued as a paperback about 10 years ago or so. So I urge anyone interested in the topic, Iver's work really is a go-to. Thank you so much. It's a real honor and pleasure to meet you in this forum, and thank you for your generosity of time and spirit with us here as part of Black, Brown and Green Voices. We will reconvene again on October 20th. We're coming right up into the 20th century with Dennis Lehane, the writer, who's going to talk to us about his new novel, Small Miracles. And Kim is holding it up. Sorry, Small Mercies. Sorry, I don't know where I got miracles from. That promises to be wonderful. And then our NYU colleague Rachel Swarns, whose new book, The 272, the families who were enslaved and sold to build the American Catholic Church. That's on November 1st. And then, God, Kim, you're very organized there with the books. I'm very impressed. And then we'll close out, and it will be a lovely follow-on, I think, to what Iver, Professor Leslie Harris, who was a co-editor of the volume Slavery in New York, right, Iver? Wasn't Leslie was a co-editor of that? She's going to pick up from Iver a little bit about the dispersal of the African American community in the aftermath of the Civil War. But thank you once more, Iver, for joining us and sharing with us the fruits of your labor and your reflections. And I hope we will have opportunities to meet you again, hopefully in person the next time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. And Kim, thanks for joining today. Have a good weekend, everybody.